particularly Peggy's. And Peggy has gone through the training. She's a certified, what they call a certified master gardener. And so we grow lots of flowers and bushes. And we have too much shade on the land to actually grow a vegetable garden. So we grow flowers and bushes. So we're admiring all your flowering plants that you have. And we call the place Above and Beyond Acres. And because what we'd like to do is create a little spot of beauty in a fallen world where people can appreciate the goodness of God. Right? So how do we create this little spot of beauty in a fallen world where people can appreciate the goodness of God? And that's kind of behind our motivation for what we do and how we use our home and our gardens for hospitality. And you know, as we mentioned, it's an honor to be here. You know, anytime I fly, I get in a sense obsessive about few things in life. But flying is one of those. That is, I want to make sure I get there on time. I got everything scheduled. And I keep asking myself, why do I do this? Since all the things that ever could go wrong with you in flying have gone wrong with me. So that, have you ever been on a plane and you're waiting on the runway for that last person to come? You ever been there? And they're late. And you got this person walking down the runway and they're all disheveled and they're sweating. And well, that was me. And or you show up the last time we were flying out to see our grandchildren, and we check in, and I realized I didn't have my suitcase. And so we're checking the baggage, and where's my suitcase? I'd left it at home. And fortunately, my son had dropped us off, so he texted my son, and we had enough time, and he ran home and got the suitcase. Or you lock the suitcase in the car, in the parking lot, and you go to check in, you realize all of your documentation's in your suitcase. Or, you know, you show up a day late for the plane. I still don't know how I managed that. I literally showed up a day late. And they were gracious enough to give me a ticket. Anyhow. And so I just think, you know, anything that could go wrong. Or you fly to Europe. I did this. We did a number of things with the navigators in the country of Bulgaria in Eastern Europe. Flew there a number of times. Or you fly to Europe and a volcano goes off in Iceland and you can't get out of the country for a week and a half. You ever had that? That happened to me. Remember that volcano went off in Iceland a number of years ago, and they stopped all traffic, airline traffic, and so I was stuck in Bulgaria. So, you know, and then we ended up in the Munich airport in Germany, and I felt sorry. I mean, there were people there in the Munich airport that had been living in that airport for over a week because there were no planes were leaving the country. Can you imagine living on airport food for a week? And so that there were so many people in the airport that they set up 200 cots up in one of the upper balconies, and we all slept on these cots. And one of the men that was with us said, "Yes, nothing like camping out with 200 of your best friends." And it was a little bit like camping out in the United Nations, because we had these German guys over here drinking beer, talking German. We had Asian people over here, you know, talking. And it's kind of, you pick up all these different languages, and it's kind of like, camping out at the United Nations. So anyhow, so I'm glad we're here, and glad we could plunge into this topic on the ways of the leader. And, you know, Andrew had asked me to kind of give a little bit of an overview of the book and some of the key principles of it. And so that's where we're going to go today. So what I'd like to do is we're going to highlight some key concepts, and we're going to look at kind of three of the ways. We'll see how the time goes a little more in depth. And as much as possible, I want you to experience some of these ways today. And so as Nate shared that I'm not going to lecture for the next 3 hours, and but I want to engage you, and we're going to do some things in small groups, one-to-one, that type of thing. So it's more than just sitting here listening. I wouldn't want to listen to me for 3 hours. And so I don't want to have you do that. And so the title of the book is The Ways of the Leader, 4 Practices to Bring People Together and Break New Ground. And why another book on leadership? Some of you probably have at least one bookshelf full of books on leadership. Why this one? And so let me start out with why by asking a question. This is an odd question, but I'll get to my point in just a minute on why another book on leadership. But I'd like you to think back about 4 years ago. And again, I don't know all of the African experience of this. I know what it's like in the U.S., but think back when COVID first hit. 4 years ago. And so the question I ask you is, how did COVID impact your ministry? All of a sudden, I don't know, again, what your experience was in the U.S. They shut us down. Everything was for several months and very limited, gathering of people and so on. And so churches are really struggling with what to do. And so I'm curious that, how did, and bear with me for just a minute, so how did COVID impact your ministry? Not so much maybe your life, but maybe your ministry here. Just think back those few years ago. What do you think? I know those are maybe long memories, and we're glad some of those memories are over. But how did it immediately impact your ministry? Yes, sir.
Yes, one of the things it did is sort of forced me to think about how I do ministry. Because all of a sudden I can't meet
Yes.
that I used to meet.
Yes. Yeah, so forced me to think about how I do ministry. We'll come back to that in a minute. Yeah, very good. How about anybody else? Yes, sir.
The offerings were badly affected.
I know. Yeah.
He's a senior pastor.
Yeah. The offerings were affected. Yes. Yeah, and that was a crisis point for some churches and people. Yes. But anybody else? How did it impact your ministry?
I think
Yes, ma'am.
the people were disconnected.
Yes.
Whatever weak ties were there just fizzled off, and strong ties became
Yeah.
weak ties amongst the community.
Yeah. Yeah, it affected the way people connected together. Yes. Or revealed how they were connected together. Yes. How about one more? Yes, sir.
It opened up our eyes to new ministry opportunities.
Oh, it opened up your eyes to ministry opportunities. Well, that's kind of my next question, is that what did you learn from that period of time? Maybe I learned there's some other, what were some of the ministry opportunities that opened up for you?
I think for a long time we had not considered some people groups in our
Okay.
community, because one of the ways that we really participated during that time was giving out food
Yes.
to those who really needed it. And so we saw some groups of the sick people that we had never considered.
Okay.
We cared for them. We saw some people with disability that we
Okay.
had not really thought about them
Yes.
much. Yeah. But also during that time we started streaming our services.
Yes.
And
Yeah. So we discovered some people groups we had ministered to before, both in terms of caring, disability. I know that was a big thing I learned from different pastors. They said that, I learned how to do, I had to learn how to use the technology. I'd never used it before. And all of a sudden you're scrambling to figure out how to use this. What else did you learn from that experience? Like back here, my friend said that, it forced me to rethink some things in ministry. And if we had time, it would be fun to explore, okay, what have you changed since then? And we'll talk about that in a minute too. Anything else that you learned from that experience? Yes, ma'am.
I think generally because of death,
Okay, yes.
I think it evolved, because it was possible to talk about things about eternal life.
Yes.
And then charity is solidified up, okay, it was about faith,
Yes.
but just death became something that was really something.
Yes. Yes, so death opens up opportunities for conversation and ministry too, right? And how about one last thought, something you just learned?
Maybe it's very cultural.
Okay, yeah.
From my culture, it's interesting. In my culture, when someone dies, we have to bring him home and stay with the body for 3 days.
Okay.
And that's right, I see you smiling. But because of COVID, nowadays we bring the body, we bury the following day. I can tell you, if my grandfather woke up and saw us doing that, he'll die again.
I know, yeah. it affected cultural practices.
Yes,
Yeah,
it does
things that we did.
and it's for good.
Yes. You know, just a tribute to Africa. I had a conversation with, he's on navigator staff in Canada. And Stefan had spent 10 years in Africa, part of it with the Peace Corps, then as a church planner with the mission agency. And I called him recently and I said, hey, Stefan, Zoom call. And I said, hey, when did you get a haircut? And he said, well, I've learned a lot from my African traditions on death. And he said, my father, as you know, passed away. And in honor of my father, to grieve for my father, I shaved my hair off. And which was a culture that he had been acquainted with. And but he did say that the Africans taught me about grieving. He said, in the Western world, North America, we don't do a good job of that. And but again, we probably learned things about grieving. We probably learned about, people in new ways. And so that my suggestion is that when COVID hit, it's kind of like, Lord, give us wisdom in how to deal with this situation. Because the things that we were used to that kind of worked in the past may not be working now. We're in this new situation, and what do we do? And you probably found yourself in new opportunities of faith and of praying in some new ways, because Lord, all of a sudden we need wisdom to counter what's happening. And so the theme of what I'd like to talk about today, and the theme of the book, is about wisdom. We're going to talk about some practices, but ultimately it's about wisdom. And I'd like to suggest that in some ways we need wisdom now more than we do than ever. And particularly, again, it's a cultural thing, but in the West there are so many things changing in terms of speed and in terms of culture. The big debate in the West now, at least in America, is a whole artificial intelligence issue. And my son's an illustrator. How does that impact artists? And the other big thing is the whole transsexual issue. And these things have just come up literally in the last 3 to 4 years. I mean, this is kind of new. And so how do we deal with that? How does God want us to deal with that? Because of speed and change that our cultures and we're personally going through, we need wisdom in how to address those and how to meet those. I'd like to suggest, I do have notes in here. Nate's notes look a whole lot better than mine. But I got the 2 pages that aren't in color, that's just in plain black and white. Those are my pages. And the other thing I failed to do is I failed to number them. And so the page we're using here is the back side of the first page, okay? You're probably wondering, how'd this guy get on staff? So this is the ways of the leader, 4 practices to bring people together. That'll be our first page. We're going to talk about that. And we'll see how far we get on these. And so, I like to suggest, and other authors and people suggest that we're in a lot of ways, we're in uncharted territory in some areas. And no one is giving us a detailed roadmap for these current realities that we're facing. Whether economic realities, personal realities, social realities, whatever. It's kind of like, where's this roadmap out there? Nobody's handing us one. We've got to trust God for wisdom. One author says that today's leaders are facing complex challenges that have no clear-cut solutions. They can't be solved through a conference, a video series, a program, or another book, like mine. But we have to learn to lead all over again. And probably some of you are facing some of these kind of challenges in the ministries that you're involved in. And what I'd like to suggest is that what we need as leaders is seeing that as local leaders, we need to create local strategies and solutions to local challenges. Again, all of you are leading in a local place. And in that local place, that is different from other places around you, maybe even in the same country. And so as local leaders, we're faced with local challenges. And how do we trust God for the wisdom to develop solutions and strategies for these local challenges? Because more and more, and we sense this in America, that, hey, just going to a seminar is not going to be the quick fix. It's going to tell me how to do something. Or that in the U.S., I call it, we minister by franchise, like in driving from the airport out to Wakanda. Today we noticed there was a Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise. So if I walked into that Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise here in Nairobi, it would probably be almost identical to the one in the U.S. They just bought a franchise, then they reproduce everything the same way as they do somewhere else. And sometimes ministry gets to be that way. We kind of have these franchises we bring in, and we all do it the same way. But it doesn't address local challenges and local issues. And so I'd like to suggest that ultimately what we need is that we need wisdom in our lives, God's wisdom for this. And I want to explore this for a minute because we don't want to think in terms of wisdom in the Sunday school way of wisdom, okay? Sunday school way of wisdom is kind of like this little story that the Sunday school teacher, the kindergarten Sunday school teacher, pulls up a picture of a squirrel and she asks the class, well, Nate, what's this picture of? And Nate says, well, I think it's a squirrel, but I'm going to say Jesus. And it's easy to kind of give the spiritual answers because we all think, well, of course we all need wisdom. Well, what do we mean by wisdom in a biblical sense? And then as leaders, what are some, in a sense, practices, some ways that we can have about our lives that gives us wisdom? And again, wisdom that's needed to craft local solution strategies by local leaders for local settings, okay? So let's explore, as you look down here in the page, about halfway down, we need the way of wisdom. And again, as I touched on, that we're finding more and more that kind of standardized solutions, the limitations of consultants, authors, and we need it because those people aren't going to answer us all the questions that deal with my local setting, okay? What we need is wisdom, and so Lady Wisdom is our partner. Let me just look at a couple of passages here. We do that together. In Proverbs 1, 20 and 21, the author says, wisdom cries aloud in the street, in the market she raises her voice. At the head of the noisy street she cries out. At the entrance of the city gate she speaks. So what is wisdom doing? It's crying out in the streets, right? It's shouting, raising your voice. And wisdom is saying, listen to me. I can help you. Another passage on Lady Wisdom is Proverbs 8, 1 through 3. And the author says, does not wisdom call? Does not understanding raise her voice? On the heights beside the way, at the crossroads, she takes her stand. So in other words, right in the middle of the city, in the routine of everyday life, beside the way, at the crossroads, beside the gates in front of the town, at the entrance of the portals, everywhere wisdom is crying out. To you, O men, I call, and my cry is to the children of men. O simple ones, learn prudence, learn wisdom, learn sense. So wisdom is crying out for us, wanting to provide help for us. And so, as you look at us then, wisdom needs to be a mark of the believer's life. Let's look at a couple of passages here. In Proverbs 16:19, that Paul says that for your obedience is known to all, so that I rejoice over you, but I want you to be wise as to what is good and innocent as to what is evil. And so we think about wisdom applied to us, that wisdom isn't just a series of nice sayings. It's not a series of communication of information. It's not a mastery of a book, but wisdom is a way of life. And you probably have people in this room that you would say, he's just a wise person. Or she's a wise person. There's a way about her that's wise. And we need to be those kind of people, that people would say there's a way about him or her that's just wise. Another passage to look at is Colossians 3:16. Let me turn back to that real quick. And where Paul exhorts, this is, again, one of these one another ministries. And so by being a one another ministry, let's look at this. He says, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. So you have the one another. That is, in this room, there are wise people, there are leaders, but there's also one another. And one another, we can encourage one another because there's something wise about our life that we're engaged with each other in that way. One last passage. It's James 1:5. And then 3:17, and again, maybe you've even prayed James 1:5. And what to say? If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all men generously. God wants to generously give us wisdom, and we need to pray. And then at 3:17, it gives a little description of wisdom. It says, but the wisdom from above is first what? Pure, peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy, good fruits, impartial, and sincere. And so that wisdom is something more than just wise saying, something more than just accumulation of information. Wisdom is a quality of life. There's a way about us that's just wise. Now, let me suggest here, I come up with that, our way of life is wisdom. And then the other picture is that, as we've probably heard it quoted, that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, right? In Proverbs 1:7. So now, what do I mean by the fear of God? And this is something that's been helpful. And if we were in the U.S., I could direct our attention to the Grand Canyon as this spectacle, natural spectacle. Here, understand that we could talk about Victoria Falls. How many have been to Victoria Falls? I haven't, Yeah, but again, when you see a spectacle like that in nature, and I would imagine around Victoria Falls, there's probably a viewing area where you can watch it, and they probably have some guardrails around it so you don't fall over, right? And so that when our children were younger, we took them to the Grand Canyon, which is a huge canyon. And so you had the guardrails, and you look out at it. And my boys, being boys, what will boys tend to do? Push each other over the side. And they pretend to do that. And Peggy's, no, and she'd panic. I said, oh, they're just being boys, But the principle is when you get up close to something like that, it's like whether it's a Victoria Falls, whatever, your tendency is you want to move forward to kind of embrace it, right? You want to move forward to catch in all the beauty that's there. It's kind of like that beauty and that majesty is pulling you in and you're kind of leaning over. And then what happens? You look down. And take a step back, don't you? And there's that sense of respect. There's this beauty and this majesty and this wonder, but this is something bigger than I am. I'm going to take a step back. And when we talk about the fear of the Lord, I'd like to suggest that that's one way of picturing it. That God pulls us in, all of His love, all of His majesty, all of His beauty. And then I think, our Father who art in heaven, He's in heaven. Hallowed be your name. He is our Father, term of endearment, but He's also in heaven. There's that sense of respect, and I see my smallness in comparison to the grandeur and the majesty of God. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm moving out of camera range, aren't I? And so that the start of wisdom is not simply asking for wisdom, but the start of wisdom is realizing I'm kind of small and I need help. The story is told of, again, for us navigators, of Dawson Trotman. And if you know much of the early life of Dawson Trotman, and Trotman, by the way, you're involved with a ministry that started with a pool-playing truck driver. If you know that's what Dawson Trotman was, he's about 20 years old, he comes to faith, and he's driving a truck for a lumber yard. He talks about playing pool with his buddies. And so we're part of that movement. And so one of the first things after Trotman came to faith, he's like, what do new converts eagerly do? They get involved in ministry, right? In a local church. And so when you got a young 20-year-old guy, where do you usually put him at? With the youth, right? Mm-hmm. He can identify with them. Where do you give him? You got the youth guys. And so Trotman, the story is told, is that he had all these young boys, and it's out of control. I don't know if you've ever been ministry to youth. I have, and I decided that it's not my calling. And so these guys are running all over the place. And he's highly frustrated. And this is recorded in his biography. And he finally says, Lord, get this. He said, Lord, you made little boys. Give me an idea. So that's a fear of the Lord, isn't it? Lord, you made little boys. See, I'm standing small in comparison to you. You made little boys. I need an idea. Give me some wisdom, okay? And so how do we then define wisdom? And this is, by the way, just my definition of wisdom. And right here in the middle of the page, that wisdom, I'd like to suggest, skillfully chooses what is good and what's right. Good and right. So good being one. That's kind of Nate touched on this a little bit this morning. Good is when we give, good is what gives life and what nourishes people. So we do good to people. We want to make wise things. What's the wisest thing that's going to give life and nourishment to somebody? But then it's also right, because it's the element of God's righteousness. And so wisdom is also what is just and what's fair. And so those two things are constantly in tension with one another. Wisdom is, I'm choosing to do what's going to be good, the developmental side of people. Also, what is just, what's a righteous thing to do in relationship with others. And it's a skill. It's interesting, the word wisdom in Proverbs can be translated as skill. Some authors call it skillful living. And that we can grow in our skill of wisdom. Let me explain it in this way. Last year we we had some work done in our one bathroom, and we had some tile put down, and I've tried to lay tile in the past, and it didn't work out real well, so we saved some money and paid somebody else to do it. So I didn't have to do it over again and over again and over again. But so we paid somebody else, and I watched these guys lay tile, and they are really skillful. And so it is in any trade. There's a skill. How do they learn that skill? Usually that's somebody that helps teach them. But then over time, right, you pick up some things to do. You become skilled at it. And so it is with wisdom. That wisdom is a skill, a God-given skill that we can develop over time. And it's a skill that helps us to help people to do what's good and what's right, what gives nourishment in life and what's just and fair. And what I'd like to suggest that there are, in a sense, 3 paths by which we can develop wisdom. And first, and they're pretty simple. One is that we develop wisdom, obviously, with the scriptures. And that in the Bible, we see there are commands that are fixed, right? It's kind of like just taking the 10 Commandments that, hey, you know, across all cultures, these are things that God wants us to be and do. Sometimes the application may differ, but there's some absolutes there. And so to be people of wisdom, we have to understand what the absolutes are. But there's also principles in the Bible, right? And they're not commands, but they're principles that help us learn to live life. Like there's a great evangelism principle in Proverbs. Let's see, what do I got here? Proverbs 27:14. And let me read that to you. And you'll think at first, what in the world does this mean about evangelism? So Proverbs 27:14 says, whoever curses his neighbor with a loud voice, rising early in the morning, will be counted as cursing. So in other words, I bless my neighbor in the morning with a loud voice, and it'll be counted as cursing. You know, my dad, when growing up, my dad was this real extroverted kind of guy. So on Sunday mornings, getting ready for church, he'd put on his, these favorite hymns on his record player, and he'd turn them up loud. And he says, it's a great day for the race, isn't it? We'd all yell, what race? And he'd say, the human race. And so, you know, but a lot of times as a kid, you know, you don't want to. It's early in the morning, you're out late, maybe Saturday night. It's counted as a curse and not a blessing, right? And just in terms of relating to neighbors, sometimes we bless our neighbors with a loud voice early in the morning. They're not going to like it. Well, I would suggest this is a principle on evangelism. That, because the blessing, you know, as he says here, whoever blesses his neighbor, the blessing is a good message. But when it's done in inappropriate ways and in inappropriate times, it comes across as a curse. And so that evangelism can be a little bit like that. It's a great message. But do you see the principle here? It's not addressing evangelism per se, but there's wisdom from this passage that's applicable to evangelism. You know, same way with my neighbor, same way it can be in sharing the good news. It's a blessing, but I want to make sure I'm doing it in an appropriate place, in an appropriate way. So we want to think in a principled way. And then the last way is, this is where we're going to spend the next session on, is that experiential. We're entering into God's classroom. I would like to suggest that your home, your neighborhood, your life, your ministry is God's classroom for you, where he's teaching you wisdom. So we get wisdom from his commands, we get wisdom from the scriptures through principles, and then we get wisdom through that experience of life, and that's where we're going to go in this next session. So, there's 4 ways to generate wisdom. So if you want to look in your book, this is all, I just condensed 2 chapters here in 15 minutes. And on page 10, in your book, got a little illustration here. And see in the center, it's wisdom. And then you've got these little circle around. You've got lifelong learning at the top, and that's what we're going to be spending our next session on. Then you've got collaboration. You got cultural wisdom and innovation. So in lifelong learning, we're extracting wisdom from the rhythms and routines of life. Okay? In collaboration, we're capturing the wisdom of the community to work together. Cultural wisdom is that I need insight to wisely connect and influence in the local context that I'm in. And innovation is how do we wisely create new and innovative strategies for local challenges. Because again, the thrust here is that as local leaders facing local challenges, how do we come up with local solutions? And here's 4 ways that can help us to do this. So the book is not going to give you answers, Any questions? I'm just trying to set us up, and then we're gonna explore at least two of these ways here. And again, by way, I mean that, when Jesus says that I'm the way and the truth and the life, I would suggest that he's not only saying this is the way to God, but he's also describing a way of living, all right? In fact, in the book of Acts, the church is often referred to as the way. And so then when we think of the way, it's like with my one son, when he was early in high school, and I don't know if you do it in Kenya, but in our public schools that you'd have a teacher-parent conference meeting, and they'd give you a progress on your son, and we'd always have these interesting reports from our sons. And so we're sitting there with my one son, Ryan, Peggy and I, and the teacher said, well, Bill, your son not only looks like you, he talks like you, and he walks like you. So there was a way about my son, Ryan, that kind of told him that, yeah, he was my son. And so a way describes a quality of life. Like if some of you have gotten to know Nate, and you realize there's a way about Nate that I really enjoy, some characteristic, a quality about his life. And so these things, when we talk about the way of wisdom, and these ways, these four practices, they're just becoming qualities of life. They're kind of how we operate and how we minister. So that's where we're going to go for the rest of the time. Any questions here? Then we're going to get into the fun stuff about lifelong learning.
Can you
Yes, sir.
cultural wisdom training?
Yes, we're going to. Can you? We're going to get into that later this afternoon. Yes, yes. In fact, you're going to do a little exercise that's going to help us Americans be culturally wise. Okay. Okay, you ready to go? We're going to talk about lifelong learning. All right. So that should be on the back side of this page on the way of lifelong learning. Okay. And now, I've written a couple of books, and it's interesting how God uses writing in my life, because I think I end up being changed by the writing process, and maybe any reader will be changed when they read the book. And so when I was writing this chapter on lifelong learning and wisdom, and I only wrote it 3 years ago. Okay, so I just had my birthday last week. So I turned 74. And so you would think I would have learned some things. But as I was writing this chapter on learning, I realized how arrogant I've been through a lot of my life. And I was reflecting back on my first, how many of you in collegiate staff here? Okay. I missed somebody. Yeah, okay. And so in collegiate staff, those first couple of years on campus, you've been trained maybe by somebody, you got a mentor that's helping you. And I really had a great mentor that was helping me in my first, Peggy and I, in our first years on staff. But as I was writing this book and I was thinking about, his name was John Ed, I thought, I never asked John Ed a question. I'm in 5 years. I thought, I can't remember ever asking him a question. He asked me lots of questions. I never asked him for any advice. And he didn't really give me any, but he asked me a lot of questions. And I thought, why didn't I do that? Why did I ask him questions? That's because I thought I knew it all. And there was that arrogance. And I realized through a lot of my life, it's kind of like, I know it all. And so therefore, I haven't always been open to learn. And again, it took me until I was 70 years old to realize some of that. And but that's what lifelong learning is about, isn't it? That we discover, we just always need to be learning. We need to be learning from God, and we need to be learning from others. And there's two passages on lifelong learning. One is Ecclesiastes. Let's see now, I have it here. 4:13. This is kind of become my life verse. We used to have it memorized. I don't know about some of you, but I have these verses memorized. Then you stand out in front of people and you forget the verse. So I don't try to do these things from memory anymore. So this is from the English Standard Version. It says, "Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knows or knew how to take advice." Some translations say knows how to take instruction. Okay, so let's just make a couple of observations here. So he's comparing and contrasting. Who's he comparing and contrasting here? Yeah, the wise youth, and with who?
Foolish king.
The foolish king. But let's take the word foolish, I'll use the word king. What does the king have that this youth doesn't have? Got power and prestige, right? Okay. But what is it that the king doesn't have from this passage? Wisdom, yeah. He doesn't know how to take advice, where the young man does. And I thought, yeah, Lord, I want to be this kind of person, that I'm always willing to take advice. That's what real wisdom is. There's another passage on wisdom, and I'd like us to explore this. It's in Proverbs, let me make sure you got it. Proverbs 24, 30 through 33. And didn't get up early enough this morning, but tomorrow I want to take a walk around our area, the resort area. I didn't get a chance to really see it yet. And so I want to walk around, and I enjoy walking. Walking is probably my one exercise. What I found is you get older, I want to exercise in things I kind of enjoy doing rather than, I gotta go do this. So walking is my exercise. So here you had an individual that's walking, you'd assume a little bit out in the country. And he says, now, I'm going to ask some questions. So take a look at this passage. It says, I passed by the field of a sluggard, by the vineyard of a man lacking sense. And behold, it was all overgrown with thorns. The ground was covered with nettles, and a stone wall was broken down. Then I saw and considered it. I looked and received a little sleep, a little slumber, a little poverty of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber. Now, so this guy's walking. You just picture him taking kind of a stroll through the country. What's happening here as he's walking? What's on the individual? What's the individual doing and thinking as he's walking? Excuse me?
Observing.
He's observing. Yes, he's observing. Yes, yes. What else is going on? Let's make some observations here. Praying. He's praying. Could be praying. Yeah, it's not recorded. It could be there. Yes.
He's taken back.
He's saying, okay, what do you mean by that now?
Well, he's walking by a vineyard and you think it would be cut and trimmed,
Yes.
but it's not. It's like, it's
Yes.
not very beautiful.
Yes. Yeah.
It's like overgrown and unmanaged, and he's
Yes.
taken back, it's shocked.
Yeah, he's kind of shocked. And yeah, I picture it as he's walking, making this observation, and then he stops. And then he looks at it. He makes some observations. And then he thinks about it, right? And then he comes to some conclusions at the end about poverty and management and so on. And I'd like to suggest that in this passage, he gives us some clues on how we can be lifelong learners. Because by being a lifelong learner means that every day I'm in God's classroom. And that classroom is probably not like this, right? Classrooms and rhythms and routines of our life, where I'm caring for my children, where I'm maybe exercising at, where I work at, my workplace, an office, my campus that I'm at. That a picture of that is that's God's classroom for you, in which He is personally teaching you certain things. I got a quote in my book on a poem. Let's see now, where is that? Yeah, you always got to put a poem out somewhere, right? And let me see if I can. Here it is, on page 32. And it's a British poet, and she writes this. Now again, look at the imagery in this. Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest of us sit around and then pluck blackberries. Okay, now what's the biblical reference she's using here? Yeah, Exodus. Yeah, Moses for the burning bush, right? And what does God ask Moses to do? Take off his shoes. Yes, to come into his presence. And so therefore, earth is crammed with heaven. God is everywhere present. Okay, he's crammed with heaven. Every common bush, every common opportunity. Hey, how's God in this? Maybe he's showing up. He wants to teach me. That late at night, and there was a struggle for me that when one of our sons just cried a lot. Boy, I found that crying late at night was God's opportunity to teach me patience. Okay, how am I going to respond? And I can't get mad. And I got to respond with patience. Just that, that little bedroom where our son was, and that kind of became classroom, God's classroom for me to learn patience. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. So God's present here. How can I learn from that? But the rest of us do what? We miss it. We get involved in the routines of life, blackberries of life, and we miss what God wants to teach us. That was one of the things that I really worked at during and after COVID with the pastors I was meeting with as we talked about what are you learning through this? This is a significant event that this is now God's classroom. What are you learning through this? And I like to suggest there's 4 little things, and we're going to do an exercise together. 4 little markers for learning. And the first one is pretty simple. Again, picture the guy walking in Proverbs. What does he or she do? First, they stop. And I'd like to suggest, folks, as leaders, that you need to build time into your schedule to stop. Maybe that's just 10, 15 minutes a week. It's to stop and say, Lord, what are you teaching me? Maybe there's a conversation I had recently. Maybe there's an incident. I got in a little auto accident, a week ago, and I learned a lesson. I was so involved in another subject. We was thinking about coming to Kenya. No, I won't blame you on that. That I sideswiped the car. Didn't see him coming. And so that's a little thing. So every now and then, whenever I pull out, that little lesson tells me, Bill, that you look both ways. And don't get so absorbed. Okay, so I had to stop. Okay, so take time to stop. And is there an incident, something happening you need to stop and think about? And secondly, is you want to explore, and this is asking questions. Here's a passage that challenged me. It's in Proverbs 1. And the author of Proverbs says that he's writing, starting in verse 4, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. I hate riddles. And we don't use them much, at least in our culture. I don't know if in the African culture you use riddles much, but we don't use them in our culture. Part of the reason I don't like them is it forces me to think. And sometimes I don't like to think. So it's easier to accept stuff. But God, kind of pulls us in. He's forcing us to think. We have to stop. We got to explore and think about it. And then, as a lifelong learner, I'm exploring it. Then I want to save what I'm learning. Right? Because that's what happened to the person here. He stopped, he observed, and came to some conclusions. And so as we think about being a lifelong learner, it's taking time to stop. Maybe it's just 10 minutes my week. And then I'm exploring. Maybe there's a conversation, maybe an incident that happened, something I was surprised about my character. And then what can I glean from this? What's a little lesson I want to learn? And I had a friend that, my first mentor or supervisor, he had a great way of capturing these little lessons. And here's 3 of them that he used. And those of you in leadership, as all of you are, would appreciate these. One is that sometimes when you give people the benefit of the doubt's not really a benefit. All right, what have you, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. And then you realize, oh, wow, that was not a good decision, either for him or for me. The doubt's not really a benefit. Second one was that, there's always an exception to the rule, but you don't want to make the exception the rule. Like with your kids, right? There's always an exception to the rule, and we'll let it go this time. And then sometimes that exception becomes a rule. You just allow it to happen. It's always an exception to the rule, but you don't want to make the exception the rule. Last one that I always liked that John had said was that disciple making is sticking with people until they get it. And by the way, if you look at the inside cover of the Ways Alongside Her, I dedicate the book to John Ed, and I quote that, make that little statement. He used to just preach that. I've learned that disciple making is sticking with people until they get it. So these little maxims, little statements, you want to save those. And of course, you want to act. You want to do something with that. So here's what I want us to do. What I've been trying to do so far is to establish a case that for us as leaders, we need wisdom. And the challenges out there is great. And as leaders in local settings, we need local solutions and strategies. And how do we come up with that? We need God's wisdom, and we can develop that wisdom through 4 ways. And one of these is by being a lifelong learner. I'm extracting wisdom from life. So if you want to turn back in your book to page 163, there's a little assignment there. And I'd like you to do number 1 and number 2. Well, let's just do number 1 in this assignment, okay? So marker number 1 is stop. To sit back and mentally review the days or the week's events. This could include experiences a significant conversation, a work conflict or success, a Bible study you lead, or an unfolding political event, whatever it might be, maybe drama, something happened in your family. Choose one event or conversation to think about and then write it out. So what I'd like you to do is, let's just take about 5 minutes here and think about what's something you're going to stop, and you'd like to think further about this to see what is it, this I'm part of God's classroom, what's a lesson he might have for me. So let's first start with just identifying maybe with something you'd like to stop and think about. So just write that out in a sentence or two. You can actually write it right there in your book. Yeah, this doesn't have to be a big dramatic experience. It could be something small, but it's something, the Holy Spirit's kind of caught your attention on, you want to think a little bit more about. Okay? Give you about 1 more minute and then we'll identify some of those that you listed. Okay, well, let's talk about what you listed. And again, we don't have to, don't embarrass you and you provide a whole lot of details, but maybe just a brief description. What did you write down here? This is something you'd like to explore further. Yes, ma'am.
For me, I wrote on work success. Recently, I work on the post and on the focus group, and we had entered an area. So as most Kenyans, we know where Wasn't Island is, or Sini Island is, and it is all, dominated by the focus faith. The chief of the area belongs to the focus faith. So in June this year, we went there and we sat down and thought of ways, because we were thinking of either stopping to go there because we were wasting time and money. And we thought of going to talk to the chief. And we went to the chief's office and explained with a lot of clarity to him what we do and what we don't do, and what we hope to achieve in the community. So he understood. So he waited until I came back to Nairobi. Then he went to that community and announced that nobody should restrict Christians from having a fellowship, erecting structures, because we were doing mostly in the house.
Yeah.
We were doing fellowship in the houses. So now, when he did that, the following week, the discipling for development leaders went in and did house-to-house visits. And it is surprising or interesting to let us know that that week, that week, 46 people gave life to Christ and they were baptized. So we have, in the group we have 2 pastors, but then they had to mobilize other pastors at adjacent areas and came to do baptism. So when I went there, they came. We went to one island, but when I went there, even others from the adjacent island came to have a fellowship with us. Now they are free. They can walk. They can speak of who they love, who they are for. So I see that as a great breakthrough through the gift. It surprised me that he is a focus group person, but he now said nobody should restrict other religions like Christians to do what they want to do at their own level. So I thanked God and I felt so excited. And I went there and saw some of the 43 people, 46 people who had given their lives to Christ. And on the day I went there, 4 more came to Christ. So there are people out there who are trusting for the word, but they have a lot of fear. How can we get rid of this fear? And especially being a woman ministering in that kind of a group. They accepted me. And here we are. We are doing well. They can give me gifts of mangoes and oranges. So they never used to greet me, but now they say, you stayed for too long without coming. So now that was, I think, thinking stopping and thinking the second time from second option, plan B, of going to explain really to the chief what we do and what we don't do,
Yeah.
and what we aim to
Yeah.
achieve as our results. Really make him. you know,
Okay, I
the
got
money
you.
is for
Yeah.
us.
Yeah, well, so that, well, again, if we had time, it would be fun to explore that, okay, so what did you learn through that experience about, say, starting a new ministry and setting and yeah, like what you just said, starting with the chief, explaining things, that's a great ministry lesson. And then, so what can I learn about how to follow up? So that's what I'm saying, now we turn that into, man, this is God's classroom, and what does he want me to learn in here? But I've got to stop and think, and again, that can be, and by the way, this doesn't have to be done just by yourself. You could process it with other people. Yeah. How about somebody else? Maybe it's not quite as dramatic. That's a great dramatic story, God's breakthrough. Maybe somebody else, maybe it's just not a little more routine life kind of thing. Like when I locked my, suitcase in the car and I had to delay my flight for 6 hours, I learned a lesson from that. That always double check, do I have all my bags? And as I learned a little lesson, something like that. But how about other things you might have listed? Maybe not quite as dramatic, but maybe anything more, a little more routine.
Yeah, I think, for me, maybe it's weird as I was thinking about it. But you said, the Holy Spirit will just bring things to mind. And the first thing that came to my mind is sometimes I want to make sense of my wife's actions and inactions. Sometimes she says things and I just want to be judgmental. And so I don't give room for her to explain herself or to even say, no, you should know what is right to do. So just finding reasons for every of her actions. Yeah. So why did she do this? Why didn't she do it this way?
Yeah.
So sometimes she just says things and I'm asking, so did you really think before you said these things?
Yeah, kind of understanding your spouse.
Yeah. But what I'm learning, as I look at the last question, so what I'm learning is patience. When we looked at the first leadership dimensions with me, my stretch or my stretch is actually leading. Care is something I do almost naturally. Yeah. So the stretch. So in leading, I am patient. And that's why the coaching is helping me. So I need to listen and
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, if we explore further, seeing both of these, man, if I'm taking time to think, what's allowing me to do? Well, I can extract some wisdom from this, can't I? And in this case, just how I relate to my spouse. How about anybody else? We got a couple more minutes yet. We're eating lunch a little earlier at 12:30, so get one more example here. And again, it could be something that's pretty mundane. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, my name is Mewry. So it's been a while since I've been here at the office. So I asked our friend which stage I should, which place I should alight public transport. So I generally use one on this other side that gives me access to the back door. My friend proposed I access side A that will get me through there, side B will get me through that side. So he explained it. He said, okay, you should try side A because it's shorter. It's a shorter walk. So I'm used to this other side. The first time I came here, I used side B.
Yeah.
So when I got here, I explained to my friend, and she said, yeah, imagine that side A is shorter. And now that's the thought that came to mind. Okay, so that side is shorter. So why didn't I opt to gain more, to hear the person more, so that I could pass the side A? And I just stuck to my side B. Yes.
Yeah. See, that's a good. Yeah. Yeah. Why didn't I listen? Yeah. Yeah. What is it I can discover about? Is there a lesson that God wants to teach? Something little simple like that maybe reveals something about my character. Well, we're going to come back after lunch here, and we're going to take a couple of these and talk about how could we explore some of these. And in the exercise, I've got some questions. I want us to come up with some questions together. And so again, this can be something you can do with another person, or you can do yourself. But see, what we're doing is we're learning to extract wisdom from life, because all of life is God's classroom. And if we're to be wise people, we need to learn how to extract and to realize that this is learning from life for life. You know, for the rest of my life, I'm going to be a lifelong learner. Okay? So I've got 12:30. Understand that lunch is in the same place.